Policymakers need to understand about advancing inclusive research that they have an opportunity to drive awareness for patients in their communities about the value of clinical research.
Hello, everyone. My name is Naomi Smith, and I'm the Research Policy Analyst with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and I'm so excited to welcome you to the first ever all-virtual annual legislative conference. Although we're in challenging times, we are so excited to present this panel to you, Why Black Participation Matters in Clinical Trials, to provide great insight into the search for a COVID-19 vaccine. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this session, Eli Lilly, Biogen, Genentech, and Bristol Myers Squibb. We greatly appreciate your support. Now I'd like to welcome Congresswoman Robin Kelly from the great state of Illinois to provide opening remarks. Congresswoman Kelly has dedicated her career to public service as an advocate for Illinois families since being elected to serve in Congress in 2013. Congresswoman Kelly has been a strong advocate for the collection and releasing of demographic data, including race and ethnicity as it relates to COVID-19, and has taken the charge to expand COVID-19 testing in her community. Her passion for health equity not only benefits the family of Illinois, but the entire country through her work in the Kelly Report of 2015. Please welcome Congresswoman Kelly.
Thank you, Naomi. Hi, I'm Congresswoman Robin Kelly, Chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust. Let me start by saying thank you for joining us. With the COVID-19 pandemic changing plans, I'm glad that ALC is still happening, even if it is online. The gathering is a unique opportunity for us to show off the best and brightest ideas, policies, and innovations we have to be discussed and taken back to our communities to empower, uplift, and strengthen our neighborhoods. As much as I miss seeing you all in person, I know that all the traditional benefits of ALC will still come out of this digital convening. This panel is especially important given our current situation, why Black participation in clinical trials matter. In short, the answer is if we aren't part of the trials, we aren't part of the cures, plain and simple. If we aren't participating in trials, we won't know if there are side effects that are more common or occur only in African Americans. We won't know if it's less effective in certain individuals with varying genetics or health conditions. We can't afford any blind spots with this vaccine, especially given the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. The huge amount of federal tax dollars spent on these vaccines also means we need to make sure all people benefit from the final product. Now, our community rightfully distrusts the medical establishment. Syphilis experiments on servicemen at Tuskegee, medical experimentation on mothers and babies, harvesting and profiting from our cells without our knowledge, and much, much worse are all factual, dark parts of our history that breed a rightful mistrust of the healthcare profession. But things are changing for the better. Our medical and scientific workforces are diversifying. More and more physicians are focused on medical ethics and are working to identify and address inherent biases in healthcare. Since those dark days, new procedures and processes designed to protect people and their families have been set. Risk is an inherent part of new and groundbreaking medical innovation, but now, as opposed to the past, it's informed risk, not gross experimentation. There are resources for patients to empower themselves and their families with information and knowledge to direct their own care. Plus, there are now systems to help pay for the medical care and side effects associated with the research vaccine. What we need now are strong, trusted ambassadors in our communities, explaining the vital importance of participation in these trials, especially now for COVID-19. I recently spoke to a reporter who found that less than 1% of participants in phase 1 trials for 2 promising vaccines were African Americans. Under NIH and FDA guidance, for a vaccine to advance to the market, at least 30,000 Americans must participate in the phase 3 or the final trial phase. While the agency encourages vaccine makers to recruit a diverse study population, there is no requirement to do so. Without such a requirement and robust parallel community outreach, these trials will likely not be representative of the diversity of our nation. Researchers and physicians are struggling to recruit participants from our communities. It's imperative that we bridge this gap now. Lives are at stake, especially our lives. We are more likely to be frontline workers, have chronic diseases, and live in multi-generational housing. Worse yet, COVID-19 is now the third leading cause of death for African Americans in the United States, right behind heart disease and cancer. COVID is just the issue in the forefront of our minds. There are so many other diseases and disorders that we need a more complete, diverse perspective on. One of the ways we close this gap is to expand the number of African Americans working in the medical and biomedical research fields. If we have people who look like us, talking to us in our communities, who are from our communities, communicating the importance of our participation, we can start to rebuild trust. In Congress, we have a bill called HIA. This has strong provisions to increase participation in research by African Americans and provisions to recruit a new generation of Black healthcare and research leaders. While we work to get this bill passed in Congress, I encourage you to take the personal step to become an ambassador for clinical trial participation or participate in one yourself. A full listing can be found on the NIH website. Just search clinical trials. Go to coronaviruspreventionnetwork.org. You can also use your favorite search engine to just search COVID-19 clinical trial volunteer, and a number of resources will come up. And please remember, if we aren't part of the trials, we aren't part of the cures. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Kelly. It's always great to hear from you. I'd like to take this time again to thank our sponsors, Eli Lilly, Biogen, Genentech, and Bristol Myers Squibb. Now we will hear from Dr. Tim Garnett. Dr. Garnett is the Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President at Lilly Research Laboratories. Please welcome Dr. Garnett.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you, Congresswoman Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Tim Garnett, Chief Medical Officer at Eli Lilly. And as I say, it's a pleasure to be part of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Annual Legislative Conference. This has been an extraordinary year for all of us with the pandemic, the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and its focus on social justice. And of course, it's an election year. So I think we've never been so busy. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to have a dramatic impact on all of our lives. But we know that that impact is disproportionately impactful on the African American and other minority communities, who are 3 times as likely to be infected by COVID-19 and 5 times as likely to be hospitalized. At the same time, the Black Lives Matter movement, with its focus on social justice, has highlighted the challenges that many African Americans have in accessing quality healthcare, which of course is a major reason for the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the community. There are many reasons why African American communities don't have access to healthcare, but there is one that we in the pharmaceutical industry own, and that's the participation of African Americans and other minorities in clinical trials. This is not a new issue, but it's my hope that with the convergence of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, we will finally force ourselves to make the permanent changes that address this disparity forever. At Eli Lilly, we have set specific targets for investigators from minority communities. We've also set very specific targets in all of our therapeutic areas for participation of minorities in our clinical trials. And I think that only by setting such targets will we actually make a difference. But today, I'm looking forward to hearing from the panelists what we are going to do to make this a permanent and change in the way in which we recruit clinical trials in the United States.
Thank you for your words, Dr. Garnett. It was an honor to have you. Now, please allow me to introduce our moderator for today's session, Ms. M. Isabel Chaudhry. Isabel is the Senior Policy Manager at the National Women's Health Network, where she is responsible for developing and leading the women's health and consumer safety policy efforts, with a particular focus on historically marginalized communities. Her advocacy has been recognized by Democracy Now!, PBS NewsHour, Good Morning America, NBC News, and a host of other publications and networks. Over the course of her career, Isabel has held clerkships with government, labor unions, and nonprofit organizations, including AFL-CIO, National Education Association, National Lawyers Employment Association, and Congress. Please welcome Ms. Chaudhry.
Thank you, Naomi. And I want to start off by thanking Congresswoman Kelly as well as Dr. Garnett. This conversation today is very important, and I will just start off by giving a brief overview of what we will discuss today. As of June 23rd, 2020, the coronavirus has taken the lives of over 120,000 Americans. Black people are continuing to face the highest rates of mortality from the virus, at 1 in every 1,500 compared to our white counterparts at 1 in every 3,600. The stark contrast in mortality rates exposes a long history of health disparities in Black communities. While it is imperative to follow the safety guidelines presented by organizations like the CDC and the World Health Organization to slow down the spread of the coronavirus, it is also important that Black people are enrolling in clinical trials to find a vaccine for the virus. As our community is one of the most affected and impacted by COVID-19, participation in clinical trials is necessary for research to find a cure that will work for us. So today's panel will address the historic mistrust between Black people in the medical community and examples of the medical community trying to right the wrongs of the past. Our speakers today will also share how HBCUs and other trusted Black organizations are working with the medical community to create a safe space and a trusted environment to facilitate clinical trials in the Black community. So I will start off by introducing our 5 esteemed experts to discuss this very important topic. First, we will have Quita Buehler-Highsmith, who is a Chief Diversity Officer at Green Tech. Then we will have Nirandir Chopra, Director of Patient Engagement at Biogen. We have Shamika Williams, Global Leader of the Black Organization for Leadership and Development at Bristol Myers Squibb. Then we have Cathelia Hodges, Director of Clinical Operations at Infinite Clinical Trials. And then lastly, we have Dr. Asifa Mokenin, Partner at Internal Medicine Group. You'll hear a brief introduction from each one of them. So now let's go to Quita Buehler-Highsmith.
I'm happy to share. A few years ago, we started an initiative called Advancing Inclusive Research, and it's really made a difference for us to move quickly, specifically regarding COVID-19. At Genentech, we have intentionally included sites at the intersection of COVID hotspots and underrepresented populations. One of our key trials, we enroll patients in Ochsner Clinic in New Orleans, and in another COVID study, we have enrolled patients in U.S. communities of color, including Native Americans, as well as in Kenya, Peru, Brazil, and Mexico. This has to be more than a moment. It must be a movement. Our goal here is to be proactive, build trust, magnify our efforts as we need to make change.
Thank you, Quita. Next, we will have Nirandir Chopra.
Thank you, Isabel. And thank you to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for the kind invitation to speak at the annual legislative conference today. My name is Nirandir Chopra. I lead the patient engagement group within Biogen, really looking at how do we engage patients across all the different disease areas that we work in, and in particular, how do we engage patients from different underrepresented communities, the African Americans, the Hispanics, and other groups within the US. And the work that we've been doing at Biogen has been work that's been ongoing for a number of years. But I guess that sense of urgency has not necessarily been in the pharmaceutical industry until probably the last few years. And that's been a real disappointment for myself personally, but I think also for the industry. And I think the situation that we have now with COVID-19, which as the previous speaker had talked about, highlighting these disparities, are conversations that we should have been having some time ago, but I think it's now the right time to really have those conversations, but also to really drive action. And that's where we are as an organization driving action as we work to really build targets into our studies, into our programs, to engage patients from those communities and recruit patients from those communities, but also build something that's sustainable, not just for one trial, but across the portfolio, so that this really does make a difference for the future. And also partnering with our industry partners. It's great to be on the panel with my esteemed peers and colleagues. We have the same objective here. And I think as a company, we can't do it alone. And it's great to be part of something that I think we can create together. There'll be things that we will do individually as companies, but there will be opportunities to build this together. And I think it's critical that we drive this forward now and for the next generations. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of the things that we're doing here at Biogen and with my colleagues as well.
Thank you, Narendir. So next we have Shamika Williams.
Hello, I'm Shamika Williams. I'm the Global People and Business Resource Group leader for the Black Organization for Leadership and Development at Bristol Myers Squibb. My job in my company in the role of the PBRG leader is specifically to partner in with the organization to share insights and perspectives that help how we impact and influence the outcomes of patients. So we specifically partner in across the enterprise of BMS and give perspective and insights as Black employees. And this is personally important, I think, for me, watching our community go through COVID, seeing a disparate impact and recognizing how important it is for us to step up and push this. I'm really excited about the fact that, we have announced now in August the commitment from BMS from a diversity and inclusion perspective to really increase how we're impacting clinical trials and how we're going to serve underserved communities, specifically focusing in on the Black community and adding support around it from a geographic perspective, as well as from a support and resource perspective. So I'm really excited that we're going to be focusing in on adding support that is also ethnically diverse to increase clinical trials.
Thank you, Shamika. Next we have Cathelia Hodges.
Hello, everyone. I would like to first thank the Black Caucus Foundation for allowing me to be a part of this panel. And also I would like to thank each and everyone for the work you do in this industry. I am the founder and CEO of Infinite Clinical Trials. We are located south of Atlanta in Morrow. I've been working with pharmaceutical companies as well as clinical research organizations for 15 years, managing phases 1 through 4 clinical trials. At our clinic, we are very passionate and dedicated in the work that we do. We truly care about our patients. Our doctors are certified, majority of our staff is certified, and I have a deep appreciation to help bring new interventions to the market.
Thank you, Cathelia.
You're welcome.
Calithia.
Calithia, yes.
Yes. Next, we have Dr. Asefa Mokenin.
Hi, I'm Dr. Asefa Makonnen. I'm a pulmonologist and a clinical investigator with Meridian Clinical Research. Thank you, Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, for having me on the panel, and all the panelists who are passionate about this very, very important topic. As a practicing pulmonologist and as an intensive care physician and as a clinical investigator, I'm a direct witness to the disproportionate effect of both significant healthcare issues, but particularly the COVID-19 pandemic on the African American community. I have been a voice both in press, in the media, on the radio, and calling attention for urgent interventions and suggesting different solutions. Right now, as we enroll the COVID-19 vaccine phase 3 trial, even in our site, the participation of the African American community is still way below than what we'd like to see. So I think an urgent action is needed. Serious advocacy has to be done, both in public medias, in the press, and I'll be very happy to engage till we come out of this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asafa. And thank you all for your introductions. So next we're going to move into a discussion, and I want to start off by addressing the some of the historical practices that have taken place against the Black community. And my first question is for Calithia. Ms. Hodges, while the Black and Latinx community account for more than 50% of COVID-19 cases nationwide, so far they make up only about 15% of participants in the nation's first large-scale clinical trial to test out the coronavirus vaccine. And this data is obtained from CNN. So historically marginalized communities have valid concerns about being harmed or exploited by researchers. During the Tuskegee experiment, for example, doctors from the US Public Health Service conducted unethical experimentation on Black participants in the rural South. And Congresswoman Kelly outlined some of the other practices that have taken place against our community. So given this, can you discuss whose role it is to persuade Black and Brown communities to participate in clinical trials? And can you talk about those historical practices?
Yes. So I wouldn't say persuade, but we are always seeking volunteers for clinical trials, particularly minorities. So when you look at the Tuskegee experiment, that's exactly what it was, an experiment. There was no informed consent involved, which is very essential to clinical trials. This form is essential because it details every aspect of the clinical trial to where when you sign it, you're making an informed decision for yourself and the next generation. This form also allows you to withdraw consent at any point for any reason. So with the experiment with Tuskegee, these patients were not informed at all, and they were taken advantage of as well as their families. And they wasn't receiving treatment as they were told. It was very unethical. So now, we try to inform the community because it's a lack of understanding about clinical trials in itself, the process of it, the phases. The whole point of it is to determine that it's safe and effective in order to go to the next phase. So as we look at COVID, we have several companies that's in phase 3, which is Johnson & Johnson, we have AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Merck, and we really need Black participants to bring this drug to the market.
Right. And can you discuss what can be done to combat some of these hurdles that the Black community faces when considering participating in clinical trials? I'm thinking about issues around communication and the inability to take time off of work to participate in these trials.
Yes, at our clinic, we offer flexible hours. We push a lot of information out there via social media. And a lot of times it starts with your primary care practice doctor. A lot of times they aren't advising their patients to seek clinical trials. Many of us trust our doctors, but without the attention and lack of information that they're providing to their patients, many are not aware that these trials exist.
Right. And so thank you for providing that perspective and that information. I think we can move on to Narendir and discuss what the Institute is doing collectively as a consortium, because there is a consortium. A number of industries have come together So can you talk about the Diversity Clinical Trials Consortium?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity. So the Center for Information Study on Clinical Research Participation, CSCRIP, have really brought together a number of us within industry. I think there's about 18 different companies, biopharmaceutical companies, pharmaceutical companies, and CROs, as well as some small organizations as well, really to think about how do we accelerate diversity in clinical trials. And the way that we're doing that, we've had a couple of meetings so far, well, 2 or 3 initial meetings in 2020, and we've thought about, what are the potential challenges, barriers, but also what are the solutions around that. And we've aligned to some extent on some of those solutions, which include, working closely with the FDA on the key messaging to different communities, thinking about a diversity score that will really help us to think about who we work with, what does good look like, developing maybe an annual conference where this conversation is happening across the industry and with partners. There's no such thing that exists currently, but I think now this conversation is happening, providing a platform for us to share more of what we're doing in a location, virtually and hopefully together at some stage. Sharing best practices across organizations. What has been great over the last 2 or 3 years in the work that I do is that I go to conferences and I hear a lot of companies talk about how do we engage patients generally. What does patient engagement look like for our disease areas that we work with in our studies, etc. And companies are willing to share. So I think this is great as a platform. And the other piece is sort of thinking about education programs to support healthcare practitioners, sites, investigators, academia, students, etc., around this topic. So really building the right tools in place to support those groups. And there are lots of other kind of solutions, but those are the ones that we thought of as being quite important. The other thing that was talked about was visibility around collaboration. This collaboration is critical to success, to our success, collective success. And thinking about an example, this hasn't happened yet, but can we get a CEO pledge together to say that as organizations, we are going to commit to this? So it's really at the top of our organizations to say, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to commit to. We have kind of CEO pledges for transparency around our clinical trial data, and many companies have signed up to that. Can we do this for this? And I think this is, for me, it's a no-brainer. This is a must. We should all sign up to this. I can't commit my CEO for that at the moment because we're just starting that process across through this consortium. But this is something that is very close to our executive committee. They are supporting, they are aware of the work that we're doing and fully behind that. So I'm really looking forward to working with that consortium through CSCRIP. Janssen have played a large role within kind of facilitating bringing the companies together. And I'm starting to see that as we move into the fall, we will have some readouts on some of the plans around those solutions.
Thank you. I know that there is an urgent need to put some of these practices into place as we are moving into different phases of the clinical trials. For example, Moderna is in phase 3. So are some of these practices occurring now?
So I think, as Quida had mentioned earlier, I think some of these practices are happening, but they're in pockets. It may be in one trial here, or in one city here, or in one community here. It's not kind of built in as a standard. And I think that's where we need to get to. We've been running clinical trials for many years, all of us on this panel and beyond this panel. But we've traditionally run in the same way. We go to our CROs to request sites who have traditionally performed really well. They have performed well because they tap into the same demographics of patients that we then include in our clinical trials. We need to disrupt that. And so, yes, there are examples of disruption happening where we have site selection in the right communities, working with new investigators, working with local communities, trusted partners in order to engage. But it's not done in a consistent way. But that's where we need to get to. Some companies are doing better, but again, I don't believe we're all doing it consistently.
And so what is unique about Biogen's call for minority representation in clinical trials?
I can't say if it's unique because there may be elements of what other people are doing. So I guess I can talk about a couple of things. Firstly is, we are really focusing on the disease epidemiology to really understand what the makeup is of the disease that we're looking at. And what our target is it really 1% of African Americans that we need to target, or 80% of African Americans that we need to target in order to be represented in our clinical trials? And that's really kind of part of something that has been really built into all our programs and studies, so that we then put a plan together to execute upon that and to do that in some ways. Something else that may be unique is we're partnering with not-for-profit organizations like the National Minority Equality Forum to really leverage some of their data as to where we should be going, where some of these patients are, using some of their index and heat maps. And what we are finding is we are not in the places but where a lot of these patients exist, and other companies aren't, based on clinicaltrials.gov data, that we are not working as to where the patients are. And so that presents us with an opportunity, and that's going to help us with site selection for the future. Something else that we've been doing is working with other organizations that are real local partners in the communities. So making sure that we work with faith-based organizations, maybe barbershops, etc., those local people who know. I don't represent Biogen on the front line. It's really these trusted partners, and that's the people that we work with in order to engage them with the people that they trust, as long as the people that they trust are committed to increasing diversity into clinical trials, the overall arching purpose. Nothing that's kind of false. It has to be a commitment that really is true to the cause. So those are just some examples.
Thank you, Nurundir. My next question is for Quita. What is the projected timeline on creating a COVID-19 vaccine?
So first I want to, before, I just want to piggyback on what Nurundir said. What we call our kind of community outreach is the 3 B's, right? It's the bishop, it's the barbershop, it's the beauty salon. When you think about the communities of color, like how do you build external partnerships with communities so where they get their information? And certainly, some of the things that we have done, and I just want to commend Calithia, because what we have to do is we have to begin to work with locations that are not just the Emory's in Atlanta, right? Like, where are the people who are in the community? Where are they located? We have to make it easier for them to access clinical research. And, we have to also think about providing transportation, right? Because that is a big barrier to entry into clinical research, so to speak. If people can't get to the investigator site, we should be providing them Uber, Lyft when it's appropriate. We should be thinking about more locally, where are we doing the research? We need to be streamlining things like inclusion-exclusion criteria. Many of the inclusion-exclusion criteria is based on a white male from 20 years ago, right? When we think about body mass index, we know that African Americans and Hispanic community, they might not fit the ideal body mass index, right? We know that the way our kidneys clear, creatinine clearance, what is normal for a Black person might not be the standard because it's based on a white male, right? So we have to really dig deep and understand where are the bias that is built into the system and get rid of that bias. But specifically to the question around the expectation of when we can find expect a coronavirus vaccine, according to the New York Times coronavirus vaccine tracker, there are a number of companies, and I think some folks have already mentioned Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, already working to find the vaccine. There are 31 vaccine trials currently taking place right now. But here's the reality. Some can say, oh, we're going to have this vaccine by the end of the year. That is likely a stretch goal, if it is a goal a real goal at all. It is going to be next year that we can anticipate sometime in 2021. And I think it is important for us to think about, is that vaccine going to work in us? And are people of color going to take it, right? Because that's the real reality, is there's going to be a concern if it's not studied for, if it's not for us, you know what I mean? Like, are we going to be comfortable taking that vaccine? I think outside of the vaccines, we're also looking at therapeutics. I know our company has entered into some agreements, some global partnerships where we can think about manufacturing some therapeutics, because everybody's not going to take the vaccine, but people are still going to get sick and we still are going to need treatments. And so we really want to be thinking very broadly about how are we going into our communities, how are we educating them so that they are clear that these products are going to work for them. Because what's going to happen is if we don't start to educate and ensure that minority participation starts to increase, we risk leaving vulnerable people behind. And we've already seen what COVID has done. It has really impacted us the most.
Thanks for bringing all of that together. I think that's a really important point about how do folks access clinical trials, like get there. So thinking about the many ways in which organizations can facilitate travel and in different ways to get folks to participate. And so can you talk about the need for Black participation? Like, will this help speed up the process? What are the benefits to Black participation in clinical trials in terms of having a vaccine ready?
The stakes are high. By not being enrolled in clinical research, Black, Latinx, Native Americans, we're going to potentially miss out on potentially life-saving therapies. And so for us, we want to be thinking about the future of medicine, that make sure that they offer the same benefit for underrepresented communities and that they do no harm, right? And so communities of color, we have got to be aware that research is available, research exists, and we have to, you know, what I say is we have to do three things. We got to stand up, we got to step up, and we got to speak up. And so we need to speak up. We need to encourage our friends, our family, our loved ones to participate in clinical research to help out our communities so that we know the products are safe and effective for Black patients. We need to stand up. We need to ensure that this industry, the hospitals, the investigators, the legislators, the policymakers stand up and include Black patients in clinical research. And then we need to step up and make sure insurance companies, employers, states, the federal government provide medical coverage for people participating in clinical research. Those things must happen for us to really see Black and brown communities engage in the process.
Thank you. Those are very important points. And I'm thinking about Black people in STEM, you know, the workforce, Black and as well as Latinx people are, they're disproportionately outnumbered in the STEM workforce. Do you think that having more Black and Latinx workers and STEM professionals would help bridge the gaps in some of these issues that you've discussed?
Absolutely, right, because we know that if you have a Black physician, that you're potentially going to get better care. There have been numerous studies that show that physicians that are white don't often engage, not even touch the Black patient like they touch other patients. So I absolutely think we have to encourage our community to look for a career in STEM. First of all, we know that STEM careers offer professional stability. By 2028, occupations are expected to grow in double digits for STEM careers versus non-STEM occupations. Second, we know that being part of racially and gender diverse research teams offers members a more opportunity to have a significant contribution. Diverse teams drive innovation, improve scientific and clinical outcomes. contribute to more equitable healthcare. And finally, working in STEM gives people of color the opportunity to serve as role models for the next generation. The more we see each other working as physicians, as epidemiologists, as molecular biologists, as geneticists. My daughter is a senior at Howard and she wants to be a geneticist, right? The more we see people taking those roles on, the easier it is for them to picture themselves doing that job.
Can I add a little bit to that?
Yes, go ahead.
And listening to what you're saying, I agree with everything that you said. You're really powerful and really conveying really the issues of the thought culturally around our community, Quita. So thank you for that. But I think it's also important as we're talking about this, we also are, thinking about these young people in STEM. It's important for us to engage with these young people in STEM because, like you said, they have to see us so that they know that they can be us. And once we plant those seeds, like right now as a part of some of our STEM programs, we talk to the young people about diversity in clinical trials. We talk to them about the various types of careers, whether it is specifically scientific or it's other types of enabling functions that we do to support the execution of the strategies to save patients' lives and impact the lives of patients. So it's critically important to tap into that STEM, that tapping into STEM while they're young, because personally, most of us, when I talk to other Black people around the industry, most of us just happen to fall into this industry. We were not intentional about being in this industry. We just happened to fall into it. And so now our goal and our focus is to be focused in on telling these young people to be intentional about this type of career, this industry, the potential lifestyle that they can have, because we do have a pretty good lifestyle by working in this industry, but also saving lives. Do you want to save lives? And talking about the ability to impact your families and your community in a really positive way. So we have to call in those young people from a STEM perspective, get them engaged and get them inspired.
Thank you, Shamika, for adding to that. I mean, I guess we can just stay on you now. And I'd like to know how are the experiences of Black employees at Bristol Myers Squibb being integrated into Black and Latinx outreach for participation in clinical trials?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for asking that question. So first of all, some people might not know what a people and business resource group is, and we're specifically focused in providing insights to the business. And it's a group of volunteers who work in different functions across the organization. So it could be people from HR to marketing who are all members of the BOLD organization. Now, with that being the case, we are primarily touching every part of the process and giving insights and perspectives to what's happening from a diversity in clinical trials perspective. I specifically, in my organization and my leadership team, I have a diversity in clinical trials arm. And so what they are involved with is being a part of the advisory council to the diversity in clinical trials organization. So as we are looking at and thinking about how do we engage with the community, what is our strategy? So they should not create a strategy without the involvement of BOLD and the OLA, which is the Latino organization. You can't have the strategy without insight and perspective from us. We are involved with looking at the processes, the systems. We look at materials that they're putting together, because the materials should look like us if you're trying to market to us. And so unfortunately, we have had experiences previously at BMS where we might not have had Black people on the cover of medicines that can save lives potentially. And, we went back and said, hey, you didn't have Black people. Why do you think people are going to really buy into and believe in the impact of this medication and trust this medication? So something as simple as that, or even sensitivity and cultural sensitivity around wording. Very recently, something came to light where someone wanted to put together a particular strategy that used language that was not culturally sensitive. And we were able to say, if you put that out there, first of all, BOLD does not stand behind this. And so we were able to say, no, you have to rethink the strategy and go out there in the right way, because this will disengage the Black community. And they're not going to even want to care about what Bristol Myers has to say. And the leader agreed with us and completely stopped the strategy that this part of the business was going to do. So we're trying to touch every part of what we're doing. We are mentoring young people in careers in STEM. We are partnering in with colleges. We are partnering with organizations, trying to help that pipeline get developed. So we are meeting, developing, coaching young people to really get them inspired and engaged in STEM. Additionally, we will be involved as part of the initiative initiative that we announced of the training and the development of about 250 new racially and ethnically diverse clinical investigators. Since they're going to be touching specifically the patients, we want them to be a part of that community, because you could understand culturally what I care about, what I value, and you could pay attention and understand the socioeconomic issues that are going on. When you ask me the question of why didn't you show up last week, and I say because I didn't have enough money to get here, or I had a childcare issue, or then you can say, oh, well, let's solution around this and put some solutions in place. So having these people in place close to the community, as also making sure that we are geographically focused in the right places that many have previously said as well, without being geographically strategic in where we're setting up trials and being where Black people are in particular, we're not going to be able to have the impact, and we're going to continue to not meet those, at least the U.S. representation of numbers associated with clinical trials. And we are not hitting that in this industry. And we have to do more with that. And we're also working with some of the things Keita talked about and engaging with the community, helping to educate and to demystify clinical trials, because we do have that psychological barrier of trust and building that trust in the community. So we're working on a lot of those things.
Thank you, Shamika. I just want to let folks know we still have about 25 minutes, so take your time. And just to go further into this discussion with you about some of the solutions that you've been working on, what are some barriers that have come up? I know, like we mentioned earlier in this conversation, there's the Tuskegee experiment, and there's still a lot of mistrust and fear in the community around participation in clinical trials. And I really appreciate everyone's comments and remarks on this. I just want to know, is there something that we're not touching? Is there something that some of the clinical investigators know or have been practicing that we can pull out of this conversation?
Can I add for a second?
Yes, go ahead.
So with clinical trials, we follow the protocol. In the protocol, we look at the inclusion exclusions. And many of these criteria exclude Blacks because they weren't participating in the first place. So that's a big challenge. You're recruiting, you put in all this work into, getting this information out to the community, whether it's marketing, word of mouth, doctor-to-doctor letters, focus groups. And when you, finally get people who want to participate, many of them don't qualify because they didn't participate in the first place in previous trials. So as Quita mentioned, like the BMI, that would exclude so many people because our makeup is so different.
That is an important point. Thank you, Calithia.
Let me just add, as well, a couple of things. One, informed consent. So we talked about informed consent, but here's the reality. People do not know what we do with the information because we've been doing some research with communities of color. And if grandma participates in the study, people are concerned, like, do you guys turn in, we know you turn the information into the federal government, but we turn it into the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. But we got people saying, well, does it go to the FBI, Department of Justice, ICE, right? And so we have to be clear about what the informed consent does, especially because now we're gathering more genetic data and we have to get more genetic data. Right now, the genetic data that we have access to, 90% of it is of European ancestry. And we know artificial intelligence is going to be making decisions. It's building algorithms to say, you've got breast cancer and this is how you should be treated. But if the algorithm does not have any Black data in it, then the algorithm is gonna spit out something that might not be right for me. And we have to get comfortable with giving up our genetic data. And I'll give you an example, just, when Clear came out, I went on and did it at the airport. And my husband didn't want to do it because he was like, I'm not giving the government my eye scan and my fingerprint. I was like, okay, babe, well, I'm going to do it. And so I would go to the airport. I would jump on through the front of the line. He's still in the back. And so after a couple of times of doing that, he understood, okay, you know what? I might get a benefit from doing this, but we have got to be able to explain to the community what is the benefit of giving up their genetic information, because if we don't do it, I am very concerned that we are going to get left behind.
Really, we need to put out why are clinical trials important? What's involved in a clinical trial? We are in the industry, so we know what it takes. But those that are naive to clinical research, they don't understand the process. So to understand the process and also to know that they're getting free treatment, free medication, and also being compensated for their time. Many, just are not aware of that.
Thank you.
So just to add to those points, I mean, I think that education, all the tools that we need to educate, create awareness are critical, and it's not necessarily kind of one size fits all. There's the kind of, what do we do digitally? How do we engage through social media? How do we engage through print material to kind of help in that education? And so, I mean, there are some tools that FDA have, but there are obviously some suspicions of government agencies. So we've got to think about, well, are the FDA tools the appropriate tools? Are they our pharmaceutical companies' tools? So we've really got to think about the end user and what will resonate with them best. And that may be social media, etc., or social influencers in that respect. Something that we did last year was we did some social listening to really look at what conversations were happening in underrepresented communities, African American and Hispanics in the US. And what we found from that kind of social listening work was 0.01% of all conversations around clinical trials that were happening from those communities. That was a percentage, 0.01%. So it's absolutely nothing was happening. Nobody's talking about clinical research from those communities. And that's like kind of looking at where you can work out who the individual was. It was very clear it was an African American or an Hispanic, etc. But the conversations aren't happening. So there's a lack of awareness, there's a lack of information. But that, again, for us presented an opportunity. So how do we create that conversation? How do we get to those social influencers who are there able to introduce the concept of clinical trials, to talk about the benefits and the risks and the pros and cons, and I think that's something that we're working on at the moment to see what can we do in that space to create that. But it really kind of highlighted to us that there is a gap, there's a huge gap, but we have to tackle this in multiple different ways, not just with a pamphlet, a brochure, etc., but through multiple different ways.
I agree with you, Narinder. As we are looking at some of the work that we're doing at BMS, we are looking at social media platforms to talk about COVID-19 and demystify some of that and the misinformation that's out there to make sure our community is aware and prepared when the vaccine comes out. So we're partnering in with a platform to engage with the community in that way. It's going to be some Facebook Live events that we're going to do, really talking about these things. I'm kind of continuing to put that message out there. So we'll be able to, right now we're focusing on COVID, but I think we're going to also be tapping it longer term for clinical trials as well. And because, grandmothers to teenagers are on social media. And if we do not tap into that, it's a huge gap. And even one additional thing we've done with social media when it came to COVID, because BMS is not a COVID medication company, we were thinking about what can we do to support COVID, and one of the things we did was partner in with Hip Hop Public Health Organization to put a video out there that started Dougie Fresh, and it was just celebrities just talking about the hygienic element of minimizing the spread. 20 seconds or more, wash your hands, social distancing. We like to hear a little music in our community, so when we hear a little music in our community, the song stays with us. So when you have a grandmother singing the song and a kid singing the song, I think it's powerful.
Right, utilizing those tools are very important to reaching the community. And I just want to pull in Dr. Asifat into the conversation. I have a question for you as an internal medicine physician. What has been your experience when you ask the Black community or people from the Latinx community to participate in clinical trials compared to your experience asking other communities?
Yeah, so in the African American community and the Latinx community, there's hesitation at the beginning. I was just at the church this weekend trying to see, there was who would participate in the vaccine. And they don't want to be experimented on. Of course, the past surfaces out. Many people cite Tuskegee first. The mistrust with the pharmaceutical industry. They think there is an arterial motive of making money on selling vaccine to the community. On the opposite side, the Caucasian community, they ask if there is any clinical trial coming up. And when you explain to them, for them to participate is easy, but they've not been exposed to the same, past or present discriminations in health service delivery. I think the obligation for healthcare workers of color, like myself, and first, we have to take extra step to educate our community. Number two, trial clinical recruitment should involve the primary care doctors in the zip codes of African American and Hispanic communities. Doctors who have expressed commitment and care for 10 years, 15 years. When I speak to them, honestly, when I sit down and explain to an African American, take my time, it's me who's doing the trial. I care the best about you. They say, doctor, do you believe in this? Yes, I will do it. So the built-in trust, knowing that I care is what's important. Trial sites should change their zip code. Like I am in Rockville, Maryland. I should be in Southeast DC. I should be in PG County. Pharmaceutical industries should support development of clinical trial sites in neighborhoods in African American communities, in Spanish communities. I'm a minority as a clinical investigator. I'm a minority as is, and then becomes a minority as the ladder goes up. That should change. And all of us should take a commitment to nurture younger, kids to get into this field. Every time we're in our office or engaging with a patient, we should have a high schooler, shadow us. And we have to unlock that potential. So, I know COVID brought all these things, but it shouldn't stop. It should not be like the fire is coming and we're turning off the fire. National strategy to change this has to happen now and moving forward.
Thank you. Can you talk about some of the common misconceptions about the ways in which clinical trials are run and how they affect our communities?
So if in general clinical trials, they're not considered as part of care, they're considered as experimentation. So it should be delivered as part of care. Conversation should start way ahead. Like we talk about advanced directives, I should talk to someone and say, in the future, if it happens, there's new medication for your hypertension that requires 2 medications or 3, would you be interested in this? And they can think about it. They can, who's the trusted support leader for you in terms of decision? Is it your chest pastor? Is it the primary care doctor? Is it, the elder sister? So we have to identify someone who also could support in the decision. But it should not be like, today you have to decide this is what I'm going to do. When it comes to COVID, there's a lot of misperception starting from the beginning. We all have heard COVID was not kill someone of color, or does not affect. That really, make us pay. Number two, you hear people like the French scientists, tried this on Africa. I mean, that has gone viral. But it's up to us to demystify and say, there could be people like this, but there are also people who care about you, who make sure ethical standards are kept. Times have changed. We should include, like everybody was voicing, community leaders, the pastors, the barbershops, celebrities have to come out, do public service announcement. Where are they? I've seen few at the beginning when COVID was hitting so hard, in major media outlets, I've seen few African-American celebrities, and then it died down. It should not be like that. We should really persistently hammer this as a mission. Otherwise, we're paying too much we're going to continue to pay too much, and that's not acceptable.
And this question is for anyone on the panel. Can we talk about some of the regulations regarding who is allowed to participate and just regulations and policies in general around vaccines and trials?
So, you know, when a federally funded programs are there, definitely an effort has to be done to be very inclusive of everybody, particularly the people who are being affected the most. So, you know, African American and Latinx, and then the elderly has to be a high representation. But in general, in clinical trial, like what Shamika and others were voicing, exclusion criteria. It's very common for an African American to have multiple comorbidities. That's given. I mean, they should not be punished for this. We should not be punished for this, because this is not what we created. It's the system. It's the nutrition. It's the lack of care. Clinical trials should include saying, if you take 3 medications, diabetes, hypertension, if BMI is high, you're excluded. No, trials should actually focus on this. You know, so recruitment bias has to be avoided to start with.
Thank you. Any other comments on the question, or to anyone would like to address or elaborate on recruitment bias?
Maybe I can just make a comment that I think as organizations, that's an area for us to improve on, you know, that recruitment bias. And I think many speakers have touched upon that. And, you know, there are multiple ways that we can do that, in the sense that we can think about looking at safety in a smaller group of patients and expanding that out to, you know, once we've established a degree of safety, we can expand that out, that inclusion criteria, broaden it, and narrow and less narrow exclusion criteria, which allows for, you know, patients that may have a higher BMI or have diabetes, controlled diabetes, to be in the studies, so that it's safe. I think fundamentally we have to, you know, ensure safety. And for all patients, regardless of whatever background. So there are ways through adaptive trial design that we can think about that. Equally, you know, it'd be great that we can have those conversations with the regulators, that the FDA, when we think about protocol design, to have, you know, different approach to inclusion exclusion criteria, that they are also buying into that, because that's some of our challenges as organizations, that we end up deferring to what the regulators want. And, you know, they do sometimes go off historical protocols. I think they're more open to that. You know, I think the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity within the FDA is working across the different divisions within the FDA. And I think as companies, we can put in a very strong argument to say why we want to do this. It may not be relevant for phase 1 studies, but I think it's completely appropriate for phase 2 and phase 3 studies, particularly for phase 3 studies. I think that's completely appropriate. And I think, you know, we can make that change as organizations. You know, an example, you know, if you think about some of the lupus programs that have happened before, some organizations have not included enough African Americans in their programs. You know, lupus affects African Americans disproportionately, and, you know, not having, you know, 25 to 30% of patients in your trial runs the risk of you actually not getting approval for your drug, or having to do a second trial or a third trial. No organization wants to be there. And therefore, I think that should be enough of an incentive for any organization to really think about this seriously, but also the FDA to give us some clear guidance here on their level of flexibility here.
So I'll go ahead.
Sorry, if I add on the safety issue, I understand the safety concern, but eventually, when the drug or the therapeutics comes out, we're going to offer it to people who have got 3 or 4 comorbidities. So trials should focus on clinical scenarios of the African American community. You mentioned like lupus. I mean, who runs the worst course on lupus? The African American. The darker skin that you have, lupus gets worse disease. So actually, pharmaceutical industries, rather than looking at market, they should look at care first. I have requested many times, why not have many clinical trial sites in Africa? Africa is not just South Africa. the answer seems to be there's no market. That should change. Pharmaceutical industries cannot build trust if they behave like a business institute as opposed to a care institute. So, you know, really the dimension in the thinking has to change.
I would agree with that. The other thing that I think, as we think about recruitment bias, is every patient should be asked. And what we are finding out is that these investigators don't always ask every patient. They are making assumptions about whether or not people want to participate, can take time off of work, have the transportation, versus saying, you know, Mrs. Jones, we have a clinical trial and are you interested in it? One of the things that we're starting to take a deeper dive on is investigator discretion. So what investigator discretion is that the investigator makes a decision that they don't have to, they're not going to include this particular patient, and they don't have to give a real reason why not. And what we're seeing is there's a lot of bias built into that. And we need to get to the bottom of that and stop that investigator discretion, or at least have a real reason why, so that this recruitment bias can take a back seat. The other thing is, you know, I published a paper that was with some other folks, and we looked at the top institutions that were recruiting diverse patients. And we asked them a series of questions. And the number one thing that they were able to do is they asked every patient they saw. And they also had like a customer relationship program. So if Mrs. Jones came in for just like some lab work, a blood test or whatever, they would say, are you interested in participating in clinical research? So they built a list of people that were interested. So then when a study was available, they said, Ms. Jones, we've now got a clinical study. You said you were interested in clinical research, right? Like, we got to come up with some solutions that can get to the heart of some of this recruitment bias.
I would say additionally, there's the element of us within the pharmaceutical industry, but also we have a big audience here. We also can ask our audience to have conversations with your family and friends about clinical trials and being open to it, and learning about it. Learning about clinical trials now before you receive a diagnosis. So it's not brand new to you. And, you know, I'll share my own experience of many years ago, before I was even in the industry, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. And at that time, I didn't understand clinical trials. My mother's passed away a year later, but had I known about that, we would have asked the question, and no one asked my mom. So we need to have those conversations with our family, not let our culture of not wanting to share about diagnosis, not wanting to have people be in our business. This is something where you need to take that cultural element out of our family discussion and let your family be in your business and talk about these things in advance and be able to address these things in a proactive way. So we have to own our health, and we have to own our health and being transparent, because even right now, as we talk about COVID, there are people within our community who aren't telling family members that they have COVID, and then may go to a family party or go to a funeral because they're not telling their people there, because they're, you know, they want to keep their business to themselves. We have to get past that mindset.
Thank you. This is a really good discussion around solutions. And I'm thinking about the fact that our community is suffering the most from COVID. You know, we have the highest rates. And so what does a vaccine really mean for the Black community?
But the vaccine is where we're going to end. We're going to come out to normalcy when it comes to viral disease, from history of medicine, from, you know, current reality. So if our community does not participate in the clinical trial, or even when the vaccine comes, if the coverage is going to be limited, which means we'll continue to suffer from it. So vaccine education has to start now, you know, ahead of the result. We have to let everybody know that, you know, this is for the common good, for everybody's health, for family, for grandpa, for aunt. So education, public advocacy has to start now.
Yes, I would like to add.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. You know, it creates an extra layer of protection. It's a prevention. And being a site owner, since we're always recruiting volunteers, every day I'm working. So whenever I meet someone, I ask, would you participate in the COVID vaccine? My white peers are always like, yes, let me know when you're ready. Get in touch with me. And, when I ask someone Black, it's the total opposite. So, I would say, well, why not? And then, they would give their reason and I respect it. And I'm always going back trying to figure out, okay, how can I address this across the board, via social media? And we reach out to the churches here. We participate in community outreach, health fairs. We're located in a 71% minority community. So, we're always trying to get everyone in this community to know what we're here doing and what we have to offer them.
Thank you, Calipia. And I'm thinking about HBCUs. What, if anything, can our HBCUs do to facilitate this process?
Well, we need participants to volunteer. That's a lot of people, even, with their emails. Everyone is on their phone, sending text messages out, sending information to their emails. They need to read, they need to see us in this information to feel more comfortable about their decision.
Yeah, and also, in the future, each traditional Black institution should have a robust clinical trial department. I have seen few fundings going to Mahari, but if you look at the rest, it's really not as robust. So it should be there. You don't see clinical trials many when it comes to sickle cell disease, but you see so much when it comes to cystic fibrosis, because the community that's affected is, people who can draw money. So this should change. This should be a premises to demand both government support and pharmaceutical support to increase, participation of the Black institutions to have a good infrastructure.
We have a lot of people who just have healthy lifestyles who are just totally against vaccines. And then you have those that, just lack the time to try to understand the process. And so for me, I get slandered, for being in a position to try to help the community. They see it as a way of, I'm trying to hurt the community, which is very disappointing.
And I'm thinking about this panel discussion, which is really important, and how the CBC has provided this space. Do we know about other ways that Congress has or intends to help increase awareness about the importance of receiving a vaccine?
When the vaccine comes, is it going to be a mandate for everyone to take it? That could be on the floor, because when it comes to highly infectious disease, which has such damage, the fact that you have to take a vaccine in the interest of the public could be a mandate. That could be one solution. I would definitely like that to happen, because otherwise, pockets of epidemic will continue, and who's going to suffer with this? Same scenario: frontline workers, minority community and stuff.
A clear vision about the vaccine and for the health and welfare of the people, because otherwise, if the federal government continues to send mixed messages, people are not going to take a vaccine.
So yes, the message is very muddled. Anybody else have any comments on this?
I guess I can probably just make a comment in the sense that, COVID has presented an opportunity in the sense that the conversation about clinical trials happening in order to get to a vaccine is part of an education that's already been put out there. People who never heard about a clinical trial are hearing about clinical trials happening. So that really helps us to kind of, we should all be using that and say, this is the process of clinical trials to get to a vaccine. And it's been done. I'm hoping that all the organizations that are doing this now are, recruiting patients from underrepresented communities, and they can also then share that data, that information as part of the uptake of vaccines. So if there were African Americans involved, having people talk about their experience to support other people taking the vaccine for the future. I think this is all part of the important messaging that has to be done over the next few months or 6 months. And this is an opportunity that the federal government or other groups could potentially take forward in order to really make sure that uptake is the best it can possibly be. It can be very early on to sort of stop that spread and protect the communities.
Thank you, Narendir. And so before we go to our closing remarks, I want to just pull out, I guess, some of the most important aspects of this conversation. So we've covered some of the history behind why Black participation has been so low. Then we've covered a lot of the solutions, and then looked at what each one of your organizations and industries are doing to sort of bridge the gaps and close the disparities. And then we're looking at future. So a vaccine may come out next year, and there could possibly be a mandate from Congress around this. I guess, what is the most important and I guess fundamental solution and message that folks need to take away from this conversation and be prepared to participate in trials?
I think knowing that trials are much needed if we want a vaccine that's going to work on us, we have to be part of the solution. It should be tested on us. The data should look like as diverse as what we are. So education, advocacy, and reaching out is what we have to do for now, including, explaining the consequence of not getting the vaccines.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that, it's a multi-pronged approach. It's not just one thing, and I think it's multifactorial. Everybody has to take ownership here, from the individual through to the organizations, to the regulators, and I think only together, and federal governments, etc., only together can this really have the impact that we need to have from a vaccine point of view. But again, from a general, increasing diversification in clinical trials, again, we all have to take ownership of our individual pieces, build that into kind of standards, not these one-off pilots, individual activities for one study versus another, but really building this as a standard. So, I would hope in a number of years from now, we're not having this conversation at all. It's an expectation. It's just happening as a standard, just like we run trials, historically run trials as a standard, and we're probably talking about something different.
I would also agree. We have to create the future we want, right? We can't depend on others to make that happen. And on forums like this, what the CBCF is doing is allowing us to speak to our community, to really educate and to build trust. We have to listen to Black patients when they express concerns about why they want to participate or why not they want to participate in research. We have to build trust. We have to understand their own personal experience with healthcare. And we've got to get the obstacles out of the way so that we can address them, because that's really the only way we're going to really, truly make a difference.
Thank you. And can any of you provide resources for folks that are interested? Like if I wanted to go today to participate, what resources are available that I can access right now?
Well, many trials are always posted on clinicalconnections.com, and you can always go to infiniteclinicaltrials.com. Where are you located?
I'm in Northern Virginia.
Okay, so Clinical Connections is a really good tool, around the world, depending on your condition. You can just Google it, COVID, everything would be listed under Clinical Connection.
Thank you, Calithia.
You can also look at clinicaltrials.gov. I am in Maryland. Anyone interested, they can call 912-623-2240. 912-623-2240.
Perfect. Thank you. And so closing remarks. I will give everyone an opportunity to just say your last minute remarks. This has been a really great conversation. It's been very informative for myself, and I know others will find it informative as well.
I would just like to add that these pharmaceutical companies, you know, they work really hard to create these compounds for this drug development, but it's important that Blacks be a part of the trials to prove that these inventions are safe and effective for everyone.
I would say clinical trials are the way medicine advances. Done ethically, clinical trials are safe, and we have to be part of the solution for our best interest.
I think there's an urgent need to address health equity, and part of the way to do that is to participate in clinical research, to understand what the opportunities are, for us to understand how our products can be safe and effective in Black and Native Americans and Hispanics. And the only way for us to do that is for our people to actually participate in the process. And, you know, we hope that this forum today, you know, provides more insights, but certainly I think companies are truly interested in the scientific research to understand how our communities are doing. And so we do care about this, and we want to make a difference.
And just from my perspective, to add on to everything that people have said, I think this really is down to the individual, and again, the opportunity being presented to them equally, you know, as an opportunity for care. I think the doctor also kind of talked about that earlier. You know, people should see this as an opportunity for care. It should be presented as an opportunity for care, and they can make an informed decision on what they choose to move forward on. And if that's a clinical trial, that's great. If it's not a clinical trial, they have equal opportunities regardless of race, ethnicity, social, economic background.
And I would also say, let's not be afraid of clinical trials within our community. Let's move past that psychological barrier and be open to it, and be open to continuing to have this conversation more broadly in our community, whether it's at church, whether it's at home. We should really have this conversation and spread the word.
Well, thank you, everyone. I want to thank again the CBCF. I want to thank Congresswoman Kelly, Dr. Tim Garnett, and our 5 esteemed expert panelists for this wonderful discussion, this very important discussion on this topic of why Black participation in clinical trials matters. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the day and week.